Richard Thomas spent 5 years constructing one of the most recognized characters in American television history, and then he walked away from all of it, not for a bigger contract or a more prominent project, but because staying any longer would have cost him something he was never going to get back. At 74, he's speaking plainly about what those years actually felt like from the inside, and what he says doesn't match the warm, nostalgic version that most people have carried for decades. Everything he kept private for 45 years is now being stated directly, without evasion, by the person who lived it, and the account is more honest than anything that's come before. The Waltons ran from 1972 to 1977, landing in American living rooms as a portrait of family and decency during one of the most fractured decades the country had seen. Thomas carried the moral weight of that portrait as John Boy Walton, the eldest son, the writer, the conscience the audience returned to week after week, and the role consumed far more than his professional hours. It consumed his public identity, his personal narrative, and eventually, as he describes it now, his sense of where the character ended and where he himself began. John Boy was idealized to a point Thomas now calls almost unrealistic, upstanding, measured, always thinking of others, always resolving conflict with quiet moral clarity. That kind of character is easy to love and nearly impossible to actually sustain outside a script. Audiences didn't just admire John Boy. They projected him onto Thomas. Every word he spoke in public, every personal decision he made, every off-screen interaction got weighed against the character's standards. People expected him to carry himself the way John Boy carried himself, to respond to the world with the same patient restraint, even when he wasn't working. The pressure to perform that identity outside of production, in press appearances, public spaces, and even casual street-level encounters, created a sustained exhaustion that he held privately for a long time before speaking about it with any real directness. He considered leaving after the 3rd season. The thought was present and specific enough that he can describe it now with precision. Contractual obligations held him in place, and underneath those obligations lived a fear with several distinct layers. Fear of losing what he'd built, fear of betraying an audience that had come to rely on the show, and something quieter beneath those two. The possibility that after years of becoming someone else on camera, 5 days a week, he might not be able to locate himself outside that role. He stayed through the 5th season and departed in 1977, describing the decision less as a career move and more as the only action left available if he wanted to continue working as an independent artist with any genuine connection to his own identity. Leaving was the most difficult call of his career, he said, but the only one that made sense for his mental health and long-term sense of purpose. What came next wasn't the clean break that leaving had seemed to promise. The television industry had filed him under a single entry, and nobody was in a hurry to reclassify him. He auditioned for a major project during that period, and was told directly that audiences wouldn't believe him in the role, that no matter what he brought to the performance, they would only see John Boy pretending. That kind of professional wall doesn't arrive with drama. It accumulates, one closed door at a time, one passed-over audition at a time, until the shape of it becomes impossible to miss. His television schedule contracted sharply, and offers that initially came in were pulled back once casting agents recognized the problem. For years, his name attached to a project arrived with a single image embedded in it, and that image wasn't one the industry knew how to look past. Thomas turned to theater, and the decision was deliberate in a way that separates it from retreat. He described it as a technical choice, a way to leave behind the visual associations television had built around him and rebuild through live performance, where the role doesn't precede the actor into the room. Over 2 decades following his departure from the Waltons, he appeared in more than 14 Broadway and regional productions, taking on classic dramatic material that required a range of expression his television years had never demanded. Among all those productions, the role that carried the most professional weight was Atticus Finch in the national tour of To Kill a Mockingbird, a morally complex figure from another era, layered enough to begin separating Thomas in the eyes of audiences from the character that had followed him since 1977. The choice wasn't accidental. He picked it specifically because of its distance from John Boy, technically and emotionally. Theater also gave him a kind of creative participation that his television years had largely withheld. He contributed to script selection, worked on dialogue shaping, and served as an artistic advisor to several theater companies through the late 1990s. None of those engagements made entertainment headlines. They happened in rehearsal rooms and production meetings, in a professional context where he operated as a working craftsman rather than a recognizable brand attached to a legacy series. That distinction mattered to him deeply, and it shaped how he spent a significant stretch of the 2 decades that followed. The psychological residue of playing a single character across 5 seasons and hundreds of episodes was more specific than general discomfort. Thomas described it in interviews as a problem of embedded technique, patterns of expression, tonal habits, emotional rhythms worn into him through consistent repetition. When new roles required a different style, he first had to identify where the old character was still operating before he could work around those grooves. He put it directly. He wasn't learning to act from the beginning, but he had to unpick the layers of the previous character that were still attached to him. That kind of technical work doesn't happen quickly, and it doesn't happen in public. It happens in the quiet accumulation of rehearsal, where old habits get replaced by new ones over time and without announcement. Production life during his years on the Waltons was demanding in ways the finished episodes never reflected. Thomas has described the actual schedule as extending well beyond standard shooting hours, with script adjustments required on short notice and the cast expected to maintain consistency, not just on set, but across every public-facing context they occupied. In 2024, he shared personal notes from the filming period, which indicated that he had contributed to dialogue changes during production, adjusting certain lines to better reflect the moral atmosphere of the era. That level of influence on the script of a tightly controlled network drama, exercised by an actor barely into his 20s during the early seasons, reflects the professional trust the production extended to him. The relationships between cast members extended past professional obligation as well. When Thomas experienced marital difficulties in the early 1990s, colleagues provided personal support in a way that Judy Norton later described as evidence of genuine lasting bonds formed during those years together. Coordination on set, he has noted, reached a level of shared professionalism that rarely appeared in any other project he worked on before or since. Since 2010, Thomas has produced more than 340 audiobooks for the Audible platform, a body of work that rarely appears in the same conversation as the Waltons, which is precisely the point. His voice, once inseparable from a teenager in Depression-era Virginia, has spent 15 years narrating literary and philosophical works for listeners who may carry no particular attachment to that earlier version of him. The audio work opened access to a generation without inherited expectations, reaching people through sound rather than image, and bypassing the visual associations that television had spent decades cementing. With the shift in how audiences consumed content after the pandemic, his reputation in the recorded literature space grew further, and he's spoken about it as one of the most artistically satisfying developments of his later career. His television appearances continued selectively in the years following his sustained commitment to theater. Roles in The Americans and Ozark placed him inside moral complexity that John Boy would never have recognized, and those castings reflected a gradual industry acknowledgement that Thomas was capable of occupying territory well outside his original frame. Directors who worked with him in those projects have described him as an actor with range that the public simply hadn't been given enough opportunity to see. But he's been consistent in acknowledging that the identification with John Boy hasn't fully dissolved. The public still tends to see the character before fully processing the person. Rather than treating that as something to fight against, Thomas has described integrating it, understanding John Boy as one accumulated layer of lived experience rather than the permanent ceiling of his professional identity. At 74, Thomas lives in New York with his wife, Georgiana Bischoff. Between them, they have 7 children spanning multiple generations, including children from previous marriages and stepchildren across several age groups. The intergenerational texture of family life, he has said, gives him a working understanding of how different generations absorb, transform, and pass down personal values, and that understanding feeds directly into the literary and theatrical work he continues to prioritize. In early 2024, He released a poetry collection compiled from 3 decades of personal writing, distributed through independent publishing in limited quantities, and aimed at readers looking for depth rather than entertainment value. The poems center on memory, the passage of time, and interior experience, territory that resists easy translation into visual media, and that he's claimed as distinctly his own. He also contributes to documentary programs examining American television history and the cultural weight carried by iconic roles, runs career sessions for younger actors specifically addressing the challenge of rebuilding a professional identity after early typecasting, and accepts invitations to speak at theater and media institutes in New York and California. These activities don't generate headlines. What they reflect instead is the architecture of what Thomas has built since 1977, a practice grounded in craft, in transmission to the next generation of artists, and in the slow, deliberate work of becoming something larger than the role that first made people pay attention. What he's shared at this stage isn't a reframing designed to make the past sit more comfortably. He isn't asking for a revised accounting of his legacy or pretending the years of difficulty didn't happen. The full picture is simply now available, including the parts that carried real cost, the parts the screen was never designed to show, and the parts that only make complete sense when you hear them from the person who was actually inside the experience. John Boy is the foundation, he said at an acting conference in New York, not the ceiling.